Hello, today we're going to be discussing the ins and outs of buying and selling a home. And I would advise you to stay till the end. There's a lot of information here. I have a special guest today, Robert Howe. He is an attorney practicing in Brooklyn, New York. He's been doing so for a very long time. And we're going to get started right now. Bring him on. And how are you doing today, Bob?
Good, Annette, and thanks for having me being on the show. And I know you said I've been doing it for a long time. I've been doing it for 42 years.
Wow.
I never really thought anybody did anything that long, but here I am. And there you are. You also have some, although with a woman, you never really want to get into age and you just want to say a long time. Men don't care. I'm doing this 42 years, so we're pretty good.
All right. So, Bob, if you could tell us, what is the best way for someone to get started if they're looking to buy a home? And does it start with the looking for a home process? Does it start with maybe they should get pre-qualified for a mortgage? And what might be the difference between a pre-qualification or pre-approval in the mortgage process?
So that's a good question. I think you should get your own house in order before you start looking at other people's houses. And by that, I mean you should look at your own finances to make sure that you're able to afford a down payment, which is usually 5 or 10%, and then afford the monthly payments, which includes interest, principal, real estate taxes. And to do that, you usually would consult with a mortgage broker, and they would check your credit, check your financials, and also issue you a pre-qualification letter that says these people are able to purchase a home and afford a home in the such and such range, 800, a million, 1.4. And with that, once you get your own finances down, you will become a much better looking purchaser to any potential sellers.
Okay, so if someone was getting pre-qualified, as a broker, might I be concerned with someone coming to me with a pre-qualification as opposed to a pre-approval? What's the difference?
They're really all terms of art as far as I'm concerned. And why? Because pre-quals are all based upon maybe 5 or 10 items of your background, your credit. When it comes down to actually qualifying you for a particular home, then another 5 or 10 underwriting requirements come in, and the bank looks much more closely to your financials after you get, as you're on the route to getting a commitment, than they do when you first walk in the door. They're happy to see you when you first walk in the door and say, I want to get a pre-qualification, or I want to apply for a loan. And after that, however, they really tighten up the reins and make sure that everything you've told them, along with other things that you've not told them or they've not asked you about, are also tied down.
But they're still not truly approved. As you're saying, this process of being approved can go on all the way until they actually get a commitment that they're cleared to close. And so even with a pre-approval, they still throughout that application process, have to continue to perhaps answer questions for a lender or a broker who's working with a lender on a buyer's behalf. So it's very important. I know on the brokerage side, the real estate brokerage side, when we're bringing somebody in to the seller with their offer, we're also asking for information to prove that they actually have the funds for the down payment, which is different from asking them to prove their income. Because a lot of times they could tie up a house. Like we'll have somebody who maybe has 100% financing. Maybe it's a VA loan if they could find a property that fits within those guidelines here. And I have had it happen. That's 100% financing. Now, what happens is that sometimes a seller may not like that offer, because if it's 100% financing, what skin does the buyer actually have in the game? They could just walk away and go to another property and make an offer there. So what I like to tell buyers is that it's in their best interest. If they were bringing money to use for a closing for other fees, perhaps the title and their insurance and their attorney fees, etc., they can actually initially maybe use that money, depending on who the attorney is, for their fee to put down as a down payment. And that way it shows they have skin in the game. And if they were doing something where they had 100% financing loan or a 3% financing loan, they could then use those monies. They would get them back as a credit, right, Bob?
Yes, absolutely.
So that's the idea, is to make sure as a buyer you're showing you have skin in the game. And this is a reason why a seller might accept the offer, because they definitely don't want to accept offers with no money down. Anybody could walk away from that, and then they have to kind of start the process all over again. They might have had another buyer, and maybe that buyer went and bought another home, and so now they've got to start to have that house shown again. And they should have it shown anyway continuously. A seller should show their home until they actually have a contract in place. And even then, they could still continue to show it and take backup offers as opposed to just not showing it at all. What's your thoughts on that, Bob?
Well, yeah. Well, I think there are 2 points that you make. One is that you should, once you get introduced to the client and look at their pre-qual, you have a lot more questions to ask. Where's the money? Where's it coming from? You get a little more in depth with the client. Sometimes clients say, I have the money, but unbeknownst to you, the money could be overseas. It could be in investments that can't be liquidated easily. It may be money that relatives are going to give them. So you do get a little more in depth with them. And then the point you made with when you get deals where there's almost 100% financing, yes, the seller would want you to have some skin in the game. And that usually involves, putting, not zero. Well, most people get 97% financing. Some sellers would ask, say for maybe 5% or so down to show that, there's some interest. Sellers' attorneys don't want to tie up somebody's house with obviously no money or little money. 5% is kind of the minimum of, I think, what attorneys might recommend. 10% is the standard. So yes, well, a salesperson, a broker like you, Annette, asks all these other questions. Not all brokers do that. Some brokers just are happy to think that they made a deal and to hand off the football to, to another, to the lawyers to get into contract. And then you make a good point. Even though you find somebody to buy a house, it could probably take about 2 weeks to actually get into contract. So during this 2 weeks, the buyer may decide, well, I'm going to have an engineer come over there's a delay getting the engineer there. Then the engineer finds things that are wrong with the property and wants a credit or a repair, and the seller doesn't want to do that. There is a delay. Lawyers, of course, like to change language, so they're adding language, all the time, and the contracts go back and forth between the attorneys, for some time. And so, in the meantime, your house is off the market. There's no interest whatsoever. And then if the deal never gets into contract, all of a sudden you're stuck with a deal that is getting a little bit stale. Subsequent purchasers, prospective purchasers may say, well, what happened? This has been on, this was in contract. It fell through. Is there something wrong with the house? Etc. So it's not a good look. You should probably maybe not as actively show the house, but keep the house being shown while the engineer is doing their inspection, while the attorneys are going back and forth about language, just so that if the deal doesn't get into contract, you're not starting over from square one.
Okay, sounds good. So another thing that folks have to remember is that when they're making an offer, it's not just about this is how much I want to pay. It's this is how much I want to pay. This is when I'd like to close. Maybe there are some items there that you want to make sure are really there. So maybe there's all brand new appliances there. My opinion is if you're buying something and your expectation is that all these high-end appliances are going to be there, and maybe I've become a little skeptical over the years, Bob, but I think that they should actually write down the serial numbers. When that home inspector goes in, part of their report should be to put serial numbers in. I've actually seen people swap things out. I mean, insane things. I once saw someone take a faucet out and put an old faucet back in. And I'm like, are you kidding me? And she's like, well, it's a faucet. We just have to provide a faucet. I'm like, no, you showed it with this faucet. That's the faucet that should be there. So I think that people should err on the side of caution. All these little things, especially when it's a buyer who's putting very little down. All of these little things can really upset a transaction. So it's important to put down what is included, and also perhaps print out a copy of the actual listing, because that listing has a lot of details in it. And you want to make sure that you're actually getting what was proposed to you. And so to me, that's the best way, is to take that printout. When you get your appraisal done, make sure that your home inspector knows that you want to have serial numbers placed in there. Sometimes an appliance might disappear. Statues, usually a statue, if it's mounted, is part of the property itself. But yet someone might say, well, that's just my garden statue, but you bolted it down to a cement block, let's say. Well, that just became part of the property. It's no longer just a statue that's hanging out in a garden. What's your take on that, Bob?
Well, so look, when you're looking at houses, you see dozens of them. And the human mind just can't remember everything that was in one house, not another house, not another house. So probably, of course, not everybody can have you as a broker, Annette, but maybe a purchaser should take some pictures of stuff that they see, just to remind them, how the setup is, or what are some of the things that are really attracted to them. So when they're asked to decide among houses, they really kind of remember, what the place looked like, what it had, what it didn't have. Also, that comes in handy as you get closer at closing, when you do the walkthrough just before closing. And you may say, hey, I thought there was a stainless refrigerator there. This is a white refrigerator. What happened? Or I thought there was a very expensive stove, installed. Now there's a cheap, a rental type stove in there. So that could, present a lot of issues. Stuff that gets bolted in. One of my clients was a carpenter. He was so proud he built this workbench in the garage, bolted it down. To him, it was state of the art. People who bought it had no craftsman skills whatsoever, just looked at this as taking up space. And of course, now it's bolted and cemented into the ground. So there's not a heck of a lot that they can really, do, with it. So that becomes a point of contention. Fortunately, my and your experience is that most of this happens rarely, but it does happen occasionally. And that's why I have white hair and you don't.
I dyed my hair. Come on, Bob. I dyed my hair. It went white a long time ago because I think most of my deals, at least in the borough of Brooklyn, have some kind of crazy stuff that goes along with them. For example, people who just think they can add on extensions and they go out and maybe they got a contractor and they got it permitted, and then they never had the city come in to sign off on everything that was done. And many times, years and years and years go by, and maybe it's 25 years later, and now that person is going to sell the house. And I had this specifically happen. The guy buying the house happened to be an architect. And I'm not sure, it might even have been a deal we did through you. And the architect was like, well, there's no sign off on the permit. And the seller had passed on. So it was her son who had inherited the house. And he says, oh, look, that was, 25 plus years ago. I'm afraid if I have the city come in now, I may get other violations. And so the end up of it was that at the table, the architect was like, look, I still want my sign off. And we pulled all even the handwritten logs. We were able to show that, hey, we didn't have the signature. I told the owner or the administrator for the estate. And he decided that instead of going out and getting the inspection done and maybe putting in some light bulbs and a hand railing and things that, would make it so that he wouldn't have these little tiny violations, I believe at the table he gave up $100,000. I'm pretty sure that was the amount, because the extension was 1/3 of the square footage of the house. Mm-hmm. And the architect, he knew and realized, I told them from the beginning, because I tend to go to the inspections and all. And a lot of times I am the person who's there with the buyer, even if it's not my buyer, because I like to hear what's being said. And when right away he was like, what's the story with this? So I went back to the owner. I says, okay, this right here is, going to be an issue. By the way, he happens to be an architect, so it definitely will become an issue. Do you want to move forward with this deal? And he liked the price and everything. But in the end, the price was $100,000 less because we were at the table. And the buyer was like, look, I'm not going to close, unless you give me something that will offset it. Because the truth is, the building department could come back and say, well, no, we're not agreeing to it. And now they would have had to remove that space, which is an extreme cost in addition to having to rebuild. So I don't know if you remember that. Have you had many of those kinds of things going on with extensions and all in Brooklyn?
Well, there are several variations on this theme. One is the seller over the years added stuff, and when confronted with, should I hire a contractor and an architect and pay those fees and get everything done legally and signed off, the seller usually opts, no, let's do it the cheap way. Let's do it. Nobody will know. Well, we both know that people will know. So that's the one level where the person just does it with nothing. Second level is where the person does start out and there is a permit filed and the contractor does their work, and contractor or the architect never goes back to the building department to get it signed off. Why? lazy, bad business practices, maybe didn't think it would pass inspection. Maybe they had a falling out somewhere along the line with the homeowner, and said, screw them, I'll just get paid, I'll finish the job, and they'll be stuck with an open permit. Maybe the permit was because of a subcontractor that they brought in, just did the job, but never followed through with the sign off. So open permits are a big problem. You would think you can just kind of get them closed, but the work to get them closed is just as hard as the work to have done it, properly. A lot of times also, one variation of permits is that people get a permit but never did the work. So the permit's still sitting there. Once again, you think that's an easy thing to just say, we didn't do it. City doesn't go for that. They need a lot of stuff to prove that nothing was done before they close the permit.
I experienced that myself, Bob. After Hurricane Sandy, several electric permits were taken out from companies that I didn't authorize to do any work. So there was one company that did the work, and then there's the new company that was being hired to do the work. And they couldn't get their permit because there was already an open existing permit. And turned out that the person who had come to my house had passed away. Fortunately, the company was still in business and I was able to get a hold of them. But like you said, sometimes it's such a nightmare. And for me, it was an extra big deal because this was after Hurricane Sandy. So it wasn't just a question of, hey, I want to upgrade my electric. It was, I need to fix this whole building, and this electrical thing here is a big problem. So we finally did get it removed, but it was a real headache, and it really taught me to, even above being a broker, because they don't teach this to you in real estate school. None of this stuff we're talking about here, folks, is taught to real estate salespeople or brokers in the classes that we have to pass to have a license. This comes from years of experience in dealing with these kinds of issues. About a situation where maybe someone didn't close out a permit. However, there are situations, and I find this to be almost somewhat commonplace in the borough of Brooklyn, will add things on. So I once had someone who added on a garage, and when they had to have the, because it was not permitted, they had to take it down. And then what happened was the man's son who put it up thought he could take it down just because he put it up. He could just take it down. Yep. And folks, it doesn't work that way. There was already a violation because the neighbors had complained. All you have to have is one neighbor who doesn't like you. And it doesn't matter because when you go to sell the property, person usually will ask for a survey, and then that would have shown that there was an extra building that wasn't there previously, so that they would have figured out by then that it was a problem and you wouldn't be able to close. But this person thought that they could just take it down, and so the city was actually threatening to give them, it was a $25,000 fine for putting it up, and they were threatening to give them an additional $25,000 fine for taking it down without a permit.
Yeah.
So
it is hard to believe that you can't take it down a garage without a permit. Obviously, it's sensible to know you can't put one up without a permit, but taking one down doesn't seem to have the same. But right, it is kind of a quirky thing that you can't take it down without permission.
Right. Now, another thing that you probably come across quite often are houses that are up for sale, let's say, as a 3-family, and it's really a 2-family. But to the buyer who is unaware, it looks like it's a 3-family, right? It's got separate bathrooms, it's got separate kitchens. Someone probably put them in illegally. And so what's the situation on something like that? I hear of lenders approving these things sometimes. And then what happens to the person if the building department comes and knocks on the door and wants to see that particular unit?
Yeah, well, yeah. So there are some buildings that this is a common problem. A lot of properties were built before, I think, 1938 that didn't require certificates of occupancy. So what had happened is the Department of Finance goes around and they may see 2 mailboxes, 2 gas meters. Bingo. For them, it's a 2-family. All right. And many times that stands up in terms of, confirming what it is, a 1 or a 2-family house. But now you're finding there are some illegal conversions, and the illegal conversions are now the problem. You could theoretically go to the building department and ask for what's called a letter of no objection, saying that there's insufficient documentation to show what it is, and the city may or may not sign off saying that, yes, we will allow you to use it as this type of an occupancy. But the city is a little schizophrenic in a sense that they're now allowing people to rent out basements. In the past, they didn't allow them to live out, rent out basements. But then on the other hand, they're being strict on, well, could this property be could we use it as a 3? No, you can only use it as a 2, or you can only use it as a 1. So it's this strange atmosphere that we are in right now. Certainly, lack of rental properties is an issue, and people are using either their basements or maybe garages or buildings that are somehow on the property and for some reason or another, and renting those out. So the lack of affordable housing is also adding, to this issue.
So, Bob, just because someone is renting out an apartment and the city says that they're allowing these things now, does that mean that they can just go rent that apartment out, or should they be going to the building department to get one of these letters of no objection, even though maybe they wouldn't need a permit?
You even buy a house, you should have it nailed down what you can and can't do. Because you are offering a certain amount of money for a 2-family, and if it's a 1-family, it's just not, it could be worth $100,000 less or so. So all of these things should be ironed out, but during the whole title, search issue, what it exactly is. And if it's besides it not conforming to building department regulations, illegal apartments present a whole host of different issues in the event that tenant decides not to pay rent. It's really a problem. So you need to iron that out way before you close on a property.
Right. Now, speaking of not paying rent, how long is it taking now to evict if someone's buying a multifamily home? How long is it taking right now? Do you have any idea in New York? I mean, I know you don't handle evictions a lot, but I'm sure you're involved in some degree.
It's taking more than a year.
Wow.
In COVID, it took 2 years because there was the overlay of the illness and the quarantine. But between Albany and the city council, a whole new host of laws have been enacted to protect the tenant, and nothing has been enacted to protect the landlord. So it is that much harder to evict people, either for no reason. Say you just want the apartment for a child, your own child, or you want the apartment because the tenant's not paying rent. it is substantially more difficult to evict a tenant in New York City because of the rent laws, eviction laws that have been enacted over the last couple of years. So there are a lot of people who now are shying away from buying, multifamily properties. I mean, you can afford to have a multifamily property if you have a portfolio of multiple buildings where if one tenant stops paying, then the other tenants will sort of carry it for a while. But if you're a small landlord with one or two buildings and one of your tenants stops paying, that's a major, major issue.
Now that you've made it to this point, we're sure you took away some valuable tips, and that's our intention, is to give you information before these situations arise. However, each person is a little bit different, their situation. And so if you'd like to make a follow-up appointment to speak with Annette Fisher, you can do so either by calling the office number, or you could also use that QR code and then book an appointment through Calendly for either a Zoom call or a phone call. Thank you so much. And now for information on how to contact Robert Howe. Robert Howe can be found at the law office of Robert Howe. And if you're a homeowner and are wondering what to do to make sure your real estate ducks are in a row, just give his office a call, and you can reach him at 718-748-9700, and that QR code there is for his website. Thank you.